In the gilded pages of American social history, where fortunes were forged and dynasties reigned, no story is more luminous or more quietly tragic than that of the Cushing sisters. They were three women bred for greatness, meticulously crafted by an ambitious mother to conquer the very apex of wealth and power. This is the story of their spectacular ascent, their reign as the queens of high society, and the staggering, often secret cost of a life lived in the pursuit of perfection. Before we dive into this spectacular story, please take a second to subscribe. Our story begins not in the glittering ballrooms of Manhattan, but in the quiet, intellectual enclave of Brookline, Massachusetts, a world of academic prestige and old Boston Brahmin restraint. Here, in a stately home at 305 Walnut Street, lived the Cushing family, a household governed by two powerful yet profoundly different forces. The patriarch was the world-famous doctor, Harvey Cushing, a figure of almost mythical stature in the realm of medicine. He was the father of modern neurosurgery, a pioneer who ventured into the delicate landscape of the human brain with a skill and daring that had never been seen before. In the operating theater, he was a god, his hands saving lives and revolutionizing a field once considered a death sentence. His brilliance was undeniable, rewarded with a Pulitzer Prize for his biography of his mentor, Sir William Osler, and the reverence of the entire medical world. But at home, this god was a distant, often remote figure. His genius demanded absolute devotion to his work, leaving him with little time or emotional energy for the domestic sphere. He was the source of the family's immense prestige, the bedrock of their respected name, but he was not the architect of their social destiny. That role belonged entirely to his wife. Catherine Gogi Crowell Cushing was the true strategist, the relentless visionary who saw her daughters not simply as children to be loved, but as assets to be cultivated, polished, and masterfully deployed. While her husband mapped the human brain, Gogi mapped the intricate social hierarchies of the American elite. She was the daughter of a prominent Cleveland physician, and she understood the world of professional men, but she harbored ambitions that reached far beyond the comfortable life of a doctor's wife. She observed the world around her with a cool, unsentimental eye and drew a stark conclusion about the station of women in the early 20th century. For the women of her class, there was only one true path to power, one career that mattered above all others: marriage. Not a marriage for love or companionship or any of the sentimental notions that filled popular novels. Gogi envisioned marriage as a strategic alliance, a dynastic merger. It was the ultimate corporation, and her daughters would be groomed to become its most sought-after chief executives. This philosophy became the central organizing principle of the Cushing household. Gogi was a general preparing her troops for a campaign, and the training was rigorous, subtle, and all-encompassing. Every detail was curated, every lesson meticulously planned. She identified the unique strengths of each of her three daughters and tailored their education accordingly, like a master jeweler cutting different facets into precious stones to maximize their brilliance. The eldest was Mary Benedict, known to the family as Minnie. She was not a conventional beauty, possessing a more serious intellectual cast to her features. Gogi, in her pragmatic way, understood that Minnie's path would not be won with dazzling looks. Her currency would be her mind, her poise, and her substance. Minnie was groomed to be the perfect companion for a man of immense wealth and stature, who had outgrown the need for a flighty debutante and instead required a sophisticated, intelligent partner to manage his grand estates and preside over his table with quiet authority. She was encouraged to read widely, to cultivate a deep knowledge of literature and the arts, and to master the art of conversation that was both engaging and discreet. She was the intellectual, the solid, dependable, blue-chip stock in Gogi's portfolio. Then came the middle daughter, Betsey Maria, later known simply as Betsey. If Minnie was the intellect, Betsey was the dutiful diplomat. Possessed of a classic, understated beauty and an innate grace, Betsey had a calm, steady temperament. Gogey saw in her the ideal qualities of a political wife or the mistress of a great financial dynasty. She exuded an aura of serene capability. Her training was focused on the fine art of social navigation. She learned how to be an impeccable hostess, to manage sprawling households with their armies of staff, to remember the names and interests of hundreds of influential people, and to always present a placid and elegant facade to the world, no matter the turmoil beneath. Betsey was taught that her role was to be a supportive, stabilizing force, the velvet glove on the iron fist of a powerful man. She was the secure bond, guaranteed to yield a high return. Finally, there was the youngest, the crown jewel of Gogey's collection, Barbara, who would forever be known as Babe. Babe was blessed with an extraordinary, breathtaking beauty. She had a swan-like neck, delicate features, and a luminous quality that made her stand out in any room. From a young age, Gogey understood that Babe's beauty was a weapon of immense power. Her upbringing was a masterclass in the preservation and presentation of this gift. Her posture, her walk, her voice, her smile, every element was refined and perfected. She was taught that her appearance was her primary responsibility, a work of art to be maintained with disciplined precision. While her sisters were absorbing literature or diplomatic nuance, Babe was absorbing the gospel of style, learning how to dress, how to be photographed, how to be an object of universal admiration. She was the radiant beauty, the dazzling high-risk, high-reward investment that, if placed correctly, could capture the ultimate prize. Across the board, the Cushing sisters' education was relentlessly focused on the external. They learned French, mastered etiquette, and were drilled in the art of listening more than they spoke. They were taught that a woman's opinions should be charming but never challenging, her wit sharp but never wounding. Gogey's famous dictum, one she borrowed and perfected, was that a woman could never be too rich or too thin. It was a philosophy that spoke volumes about a life measured by aesthetics and acquisition. Their home in Brookline was not a warm, nurturing haven. It was a finishing school for aristocrats, an incubator for future queens. The goal was nothing less than the conquest of America's great family dynasties, the Roosevelts, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys. Gogey Cushing was playing a high-stakes game of chess, and her daughters were her exquisitely crafted queens, poised to sweep across the board. For a time, the family seemed to exist in a state of perfect ascendant promise. Dr. Cushing was celebrated in his field, Gogey's project was proceeding flawlessly, and there was a son, William, known as Bill, a student at Yale, destined to follow his father into the world of medicine and carry the Cushing name forward in the traditional patriarchal way. He was the safety net, the heir apparent. And then, in 1926, fate intervened with shocking brutality. On a spring evening, Bill's car was struck by a train at an unmarked crossing near New Haven, Connecticut. He was killed instantly. The tragedy ripped through the heart of the Cushing family, a devastating blow that altered its emotional landscape forever. For Dr. Cushing, the loss of his only son and heir was a profound, crushing grief from which he never fully recovered, driving him even deeper into the sanctuary of his work. But for Gogey, the grief, while immense, calcified into something else, a hardened, almost terrifying resolve. The loss of her son was not just a personal tragedy, it was a strategic catastrophe. The male line was gone. The conventional path for the family's legacy was now a dead end. In that moment of shattering loss, Gogey's ambition, already formidable, became an all-consuming obsession. Her daughters were no longer just her life's project. They were now the only vessel for the Cushing family's claim to immortality. The stakes had been raised to an almost unbearable degree. The pressure on Minnie, Betsey, and Babe intensified tenfold. Their destined marriages were no longer simply about securing wealth or status. They were about securing the future itself. Gogie's mission, forged in the crucible of this loss, was now absolute. She would not rest until each of her daughters was safely ensconced at the very summit of American society. The game had to be won, and the price of failure was now unthinkable. The training ground on Walnut Street had become a war room, and the Cushing sisters were about to be launched into the world. With the daughters polished to perfection and Gogie's strategy set, the 1930s marked the beginning of the Great Cushing Offensive. This was the first wave, the initial deployment designed to secure a critical foothold in the highest echelons of American society. The campaign would be fought on multiple fronts, in the corridors of political power, the hushed drawing rooms of New York's old guard, and the glittering pages of fashion magazines. The sisters, each playing the part she had been groomed for, were about to make their indelible mark, learning in the process that every spectacular victory carried the seed of a private, painful compromise. The first to be launched was Betsey, the poised and elegant diplomat. In 1930, at the age of 22, she achieved what was, by any measure, a monumental victory for the Cushing clan. She married James Roosevelt, the eldest son of the then governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The union was a strategic masterstroke. It linked the esteemed Cushing name not to the fading power of Gilded Age fortunes, but to the rising dynamic force of a political dynasty destined for national dominance. Gogie Cushing could not have designed a more promising match. The wedding was a society event, a perfect fusion of Boston intellectual prestige and New York political ambition. Betsey, serene and impeccable, played her role to perfection. She was now a Roosevelt. 2 years later, in 1932, the ground shifted beneath their feet. Franklin Roosevelt was swept into the White House on a tide of public hope amidst the Great Depression, and Betsey was elevated from the wife of a governor's son to the daughter-in-law of the President of the United States. She and Jimmy moved into the White House, the very epicenter of American power. It was here that Betsey's meticulous upbringing truly came to fruition. With First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt often traveling the country as her husband's social conscience and fact-finder, a void was left in the official social life of the executive mansion. Betsey, with her innate grace and unflappable poise, stepped into it seamlessly. She became the unofficial White House hostess, organizing receptions and greeting dignitaries with a quiet confidence that belied her youth. She was a vision of stability and elegance in a time of national turmoil. More significantly, Betsey forged a deep and genuinely affectionate bond with her father-in-law. President Roosevelt, charmed by her intelligence and her steady, calming presence, came to adore her. He treated her as the daughter he never had. They shared a warm rapport, and he relied on her, confiding in her and valuing her companionship during the immense pressures of his presidency. For Betsey, this relationship was a source of great personal fulfillment and prestige. She was not merely a Roosevelt by marriage, she was a cherished member of the president's innermost circle. She had access, she had influence, and she had the sincere affection of one of the most powerful men in the world. On the surface, her life was a spectacular success, the absolute fulfillment of Gogie's vision. But behind the magnificent facade of the White House, the marriage itself was crumbling. Jimmy Roosevelt, while publicly charming, was a restless and philandering husband. He lacked his father's gravitas and his wife's discipline. His infidelities were numerous, and in the unforgiving fishbowl of Washington, D.C., increasingly public. For Betsey, a woman trained to value discretion and dignity above all else, the humiliation was acute. Each affair was not just a private betrayal, but a public scandal that tarnished the presidency and her own carefully maintained image. She endured the pain with stoic grace, never once letting the mask of the perfect political wife slip in public. But the strain was immense. The life she was leading, a life of immense privilege and proximity to power, was also a life of profound personal unhappiness and loneliness. By the late 1930s, the marriage was broken beyond repair. In 1940, after a decade of service to the Roosevelt dynasty, Betsey quietly filed for divorce. To the world, it might have seemed like a retreat, but in the cold calculus of the Cushing strategy, it was a successful extraction. Betsey left the marriage not as a failure, but as Betsey Cushing Roosevelt, a name that carried its own significant cachet. She had served her apprenticeship at the very pinnacle of power, and emerged with her reputation for elegance and discretion enhanced, ready for her next and far more rewarding chapter. As the 1940s dawned and Betsey was navigating her strategic exit from the Roosevelts, Goggie Cushing was already orchestrating her next, and perhaps most audacious, social conquest. The target this time was the biggest prize in all of New York society, Vincent Astor. He was the great-grandson of John Jacob Astor, the formidable patriarch who had built one of America's first and largest fortunes. Vincent Astor was not merely rich. He was a veritable monarch of Manhattan, a landlord to thousands, the owner of vast tracts of city real estate, the St. Regis Hotel, and a sprawling country estate at Ferncliff on the Hudson. He was, however, a notoriously difficult and solitary man. Gruff, moody, and deeply introverted, he had little patience for the frivolous social rituals of his class. His first marriage had been a long, unhappy, and childless affair. He preferred the company of his dogs and the intricate mechanics of his beloved model railroad to any glittering society ball. He was, in short, a challenge. For Goggie Cushing, he was the ultimate test of her strategic genius. She saw in her eldest daughter, the intellectual and serious Minnie, the perfect solution to the Astor problem. Where a vivacious debutante would have grated on Vincent's nerves, Minnie's quiet intelligence and unflappable calm were precisely what he needed. Goggie masterfully orchestrated the courtship, creating opportunities for the reserved millionaire and the bookish Cushing daughter to meet in carefully controlled environments. She presented Minnie not as a passionate lover, but as a competent and sophisticated partner, a woman who could manage his immense households with quiet efficiency and provide the stable, undemanding companionship he craved. The campaign was a resounding success. In 1940, the same year Betsey divorced Jimmy Roosevelt, Minnie Cushing married Vincent Astor. The wedding was a thunderclap in New York society. It was the ultimate triumph for Goggie. A Cushing now presided over the legendary Astor fortune. The family had not just secured a foothold, they had seized the citadel. They were no longer merely aspiring, they were now inextricably linked to the oldest and most revered money in America. Minnie Cushing Astor became the chatelaine of 130 East 80th Street in the city and the magnificent Ferncliff estate upstate. She was, by any definition, one of the most powerful women in New York. The reality of the marriage, however, was as muted and passionless as the courtship had been. It was a partnership of mutual benefit, a well-run corporation of two. Vincent gave Minnie a platform of unimaginable wealth and social standing. In return, Minnie gave him a perfectly ordered life. She ran his homes with flawless precision, hosted his dinners, and provided a buffer between his reclusive nature and the demands of the outside world. Yet they lived largely separate lives under the same opulent roofs. Their interests were profoundly different. While Vincent retreated to his basement workshop to tinker with gadgets and run his model trains for hours on end, Minnie yearned for the vibrant cultural and intellectual life of the city. She was a patroness of the arts, trapped in a gilded cage with a man who had little interest in her passions. The marriage brought her immense status, but it was a life of quiet compromise, a testament to the fact that the greatest prizes often come with the heaviest chains. While her two older sisters were making headlines with their dynastic unions and separations, the youngest and most beautiful of the Cushings, Babe, was forging a more unconventional path into the public eye. Her official debut into society was marked not by a glittering ball, but by a near-fatal car accident that left her with serious facial injuries. The incident could have been a catastrophe for the family's designated crown jewel, whose beauty was her primary asset, but it became instead a testament to the family's formidable resources. Her own father, the brilliant Dr. Harvey Cushing, personally supervised the team of surgeons who undertook her facial reconstruction. The distant patriarch, the god of the operating theatre, now applied his legendary skill to a profoundly personal task, restoring the flawless face of his youngest daughter. The incident imbued Babe's beauty with a new narrative. It was not just a gift of nature, but a precious object saved and perfected by the hand of genius. Following her recovery, Babe did something unexpected, something that deviated from Gogie's carefully laid plans. She decided to get a job. In an era when women of her class were expected to do little more than wait for a suitable husband, Babe went to work as a fashion editor at the holy grail of style, Vogue magazine. It was a brilliant move. She proved that she was more than just a pretty face. She had an innate and impeccable eye for style. Her taste was flawless, her understanding of fashion profound. She quickly became a celebrated editor, her own image gracing the magazine's pages as the ultimate embodiment of the chic, modern American woman. This career gave her a measure of independence and established her own credentials as a formidable arbiter of taste long before she entered the marital arena. But Gogie's plans had not been abandoned, merely postponed. In 1940, that same whirlwind year for the Cushing family, Babe married Stanley Grafton Mortimer, Jr. The match was, on paper, perfect. He was handsome, charming, and hailed from an impeccable social background, with a fortune rooted in Standard Oil. The wedding was yet another triumph, completing a trifecta of major social events for the sisters in a single year. Gogie had, in the space of 12 months, seen one daughter divorce a Roosevelt, another marry an Astor, and her youngest and most beautiful secure a Mortimer. Her conquest seemed complete. For a time, Babe's marriage to Stanley seemed to be the idyllic union her sisters were not. They were a stunningly handsome couple, the toast of New York society. They had 2 children, a son Stanley III and a daughter Amanda. But the Second World War intervened. Stanley served overseas, and like many men of his generation, he returned a changed man. He struggled to readjust to civilian life, battling what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, and he sought solace in alcohol. The charming socialite became an unpredictable and difficult alcoholic. For Babe, a woman whose entire being was oriented around the pursuit of control and perfection, living with the chaos of alcoholism was anathema. The flawless facade of her life was cracking under the strain. The picture-perfect marriage had soured into a private ordeal. True to the Cushing code, when a situation becomes untenable and perfection can no longer be maintained, she cut her losses. Shortly after the war, Babe divorced Stanley Mortimer. Like Betsey, she emerged from her first marriage not diminished, but with a new, more complex identity. A celebrated style icon, a mother of 2, and a woman who had learned firsthand that even the most beautiful surfaces can hide a painful reality. The first wave was over. The sisters had secured their beachhead in the elite world they were born to conquer. They had married, divorced, and survived, emerging with powerful names and invaluable experience, poised for the second, even more spectacular phase of their reign. If the 1930s and early 40s were the Cushing sisters' initial foray onto the world stage, The post-war era was their coronation. Having navigated the treacherous currents of their first marriages, they emerged not as debutantes, but as seasoned sovereigns, ready for the second, more permanent wave of their ascensions. This was the period of their absolute reign, a time when they would reach the zenith of power, style, and influence. Each sister, in her own distinct way, would claim a throne, creating a life that was the embodiment of worldly success. Yet, beneath the dazzling surface of this golden age, the private costs of their public triumphs would grow ever more profound. Betsey, the ever-dutiful diplomat, was the first to secure her dynasty. After her dignified exit from the Roosevelt marriage, she was one of the most eligible women in America, possessing a unique combination of social grace, political experience, and a sterling reputation. Betsey Cushing, ever the strategist, surely saw the vast potential in her daughter's newfound freedom. And in 1942, Betsey made a match that would eclipse even her first monumental union. She married John "Jock" Hay Whitney. If the Roosevelts represented political power, the Whitneys represented the bedrock of American capitalism itself. Jock was the heir to a colossal, multi-generational fortune built on oil, tobacco, horse racing, and finance. He was also a celebrated sportsman, a war hero, a venture capitalist who famously backed the film Gone with the Wind, and a man of immense charm, culture, and generosity. Unlike her first marriage, this was a true love match, a partnership of equals in temperament and spirit. Jock adored Betsey's serene elegance and sharp mind, while Betsey found in Jock the warmth, stability, and genuine partnership that had been so painfully absent with Jimmy Roosevelt. They were a golden couple, radiating a confident, understated glamour. Betsey's master plan had reached its apotheosis. A Cushing was now a Whitney, uniting two of the nation's most powerful families. But Betsey's role was far from ornamental. She plunged into the immense responsibilities of her new position with practiced skill. Under the mentorship of Jock's formidable relatives, including his aunt, the sculptor and museum founder Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, Betsey became a powerful force in philanthropy. She learned to manage the vast Whitney charitable trusts, overseeing enormous bequests to medicine, education, and the arts, with the same meticulous poise she had once brought to White House dinners. She had found her true calling, wielding influence not just socially, but substantively. Her ultimate triumph came in 1957, when President Eisenhower appointed Jock as the United States ambassador to the court of St. James's. The role of ambassadress to the United Kingdom was the pinnacle of the diplomatic world, and Betsey was born for it. In London, all the years of Betsey's training reached their glorious crescendo. She was a spectacular success, charming Queen Elizabeth II, navigating the complex protocols of European diplomacy, and hosting events at the ambassadorial residence with an elegance and grace that enchanted the British establishment. She was no longer an unofficial hostess filling in for a First Lady. She was the official face of American grace on the world stage. For Betsey Cushing Whitney, the second wave was a story of unmitigated, deeply fulfilling success. She had found a great love, a true purpose, and a global stage on which to shine. While Betsey was building a life of quiet philanthropic power, her younger sister Babe was embarking on a far more public and dazzling ascent. Following her divorce from Stanley Mortimer, Babe, with her two young children and her established reputation as a fashion editor, was a figure of immense fascination. In 1947, she married a man who represented the new, thrilling power of the 20th century, William S. Paley. Paley was not old money. He was a dynamic, brilliant, and ruthless tycoon, the son of Ukrainian Jewish immigrants, who had single-handedly built the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, into a media empire. He was a kingmaker, a shaper of public opinion, a man who controlled what Americans watched, heard, and thought. He was drawn to Babe's aristocratic beauty and flawless style as the ultimate symbol of the social legitimacy he craved. Their marriage was a merger of supreme style and supreme media power, and it transformed Babe Paley into a global icon. She became the undisputed queen of American society, the high priestess of perfection. Her life was her art form, and she curated it with the meticulous eye of a museum director. Their legendary estate on Long Island, Kiluna Farm, became the stage for her greatest performance. Every detail was flawless. The flowers in each room were perfectly arranged, the silverware on the dining table polished to a blinding gleam, the menus for every meal exquisitely planned, the conversation at every party perfectly orchestrated. Guests reported that even the peas in the salad were individually shelled to ensure uniformity. Babe's style was emulated by millions. She was a permanent fixture on the international best-dressed list, eventually being elevated to its Hall of Fame. She was not just a woman. She was a concept, an ideal of effortless elegance that was, in reality, the product of relentless, painstaking, and exhausting effort. This glittering facade, however, concealed a devastatingly hollow core. The marriage that gave Babe her crown was also her gilded cage. Bill Paley was a voracious, serial philanderer. His infidelities were constant, brazen, and a source of profound private humiliation for his wife. He was also a deeply controlling man, obsessed with the perfection she projected because it reflected on him. He would openly critique her if he found a single hair out of place or a flower arrangement not to his liking. He demanded a flawless performance at all times. Babe, in a moment of stunning candor late in her life, confessed that he had made her feel like nothing more than a very expensive ornament, a beautiful object he had acquired and curated. The immense pressure to maintain the illusion of a perfect life, a perfect marriage, and a perfect self, while living with the daily reality of her husband's betrayals and critiques, created a deep well of loneliness and resentment. She was the most admired woman in the world, and quite possibly one of the loneliest. Her perfection was a mask, and the strain of wearing it day in and day out was her secret tragedy. While Betsey found fulfillment and Babe endured a beautiful torment, the eldest sister, Minnie, chose a different path entirely, rebellion. For years she had dutifully played her part as Mrs. Vincent Astor, living a life of unimaginable luxury, but profound intellectual and emotional emptiness. Her quiet, observant nature, so prized by Gogi, became the tool of her liberation. She watched as her difficult, reclusive husband became increasingly infatuated with a socially ambitious woman named Roberta Brooke Marshall. A different wife might have reacted with jealousy and outrage. Minnie, however, saw an opportunity. With quiet, subtle precision, she did nothing to stand in the way of the affair. In fact, she subtly encouraged it, recognizing that Brooke's ambition was her own ticket to freedom. She was playing the long game, a final brilliant chess move on the board Gogi had set for her. In 1953, her strategy paid off. Vincent Astor divorced Minnie to marry Brooke, who would go on to become the legendary philanthropist Brooke Astor. Minnie walked away with a generous divorce settlement and, far more valuable to her, her liberty. What she did next sent shockwaves through the society her sisters ruled. Instead of leveraging her status to secure another dynastic marriage, Minnie turned her back on the entire game. She married for love and companionship, choosing James Whitney Fosburgh, a talented and respected painter. But Jim Fosburgh was also a man who, in the discreet but knowing circles of the era, was openly gay. To her sisters and the society they inhabited, the marriage was seen as a catastrophic social demotion. Minnie Cushing Astor, once the mistress of one of America's greatest fortunes, was now the wife of a confirmed bachelor artist of modest means. But what society saw as a demotion Minnie experienced as a profound liberation. Her marriage to Jim Fosburgh, though unconventional, was a partnership of genuine affection, shared passions, and deep intellectual kinship. Her new home became a legendary salon, a vibrant hub for the very people she had yearned to be around, artists like George Balanchine and Lincoln Kirstein, writers and intellectuals. She had traded the stuffy, silent halls of Ferncliff for a life filled with art, laughter, and brilliant conversation. She became a significant and knowledgeable patroness of the arts, not as the wife of a wealthy man, but as a force in her own right. While Betsey reigned over philanthropy and Babe commanded the world of style, Minnie quietly cultivated a life of the mind. In the end, she was the only Cushing sister who managed to truly escape the gilded cage, choosing personal freedom and intellectual happiness over the status and wealth that had been the guiding principles of her entire upbringing. She had, on her own terms, found her way out. By the dawn of the 1970s, the Cushing sisters were no longer just members of high society. They were its reigning triumvirate. Betsey Whitney was the respected matriarch-in-waiting, a figure of immense philanthropic power and quiet dignity. Minnie Fosburgh was the liberated patroness of the arts, presiding over a world of intellect and creativity. And Babe Paley was something else entirely. She was the sun around which the entire galaxy of style and society revolved. She had achieved a level of iconic status that transcended mere celebrity. Yet, within the fortress of perfection she had built around herself, a deep and gnawing loneliness resided. Her life with Bill Paley was a masterpiece of public presentation and a wasteland of private connection. Into this exquisitely curated void stepped a most unlikely confidant, a diminutive man with a high-pitched voice, a rapier wit, and a genius for both literature and social infiltration. His name was Truman Capote, and his friendship with Babe Paley would become one of the most celebrated alliances of the era, destined to end in one of the most infamous betrayals in literary history. Their friendship was, in many ways, a perfect symbiosis, a mutually beneficial arrangement between two people who possessed something the other desperately craved. Truman Capote, fresh off the colossal success of his 1966 non-fiction novel In Cold Blood, was a literary lion and a full-blown celebrity. He was a constant presence on talk shows and in gossip columns, a puck-like figure who flitted between worlds, armed with a tongue that could dispense either devastating charm or deadly venom. But for all his fame, Capote was an outsider, a boy from the rural South who longed for acceptance in the one world that remained tantalizingly out of reach, the rarefied, blue-blooded sphere of the ultra-rich. He began to cultivate a collection of society's most beautiful, stylish, and powerful wives, a group he affectionately and possessively called his swans. There was Slim Keith, the sharp-tongued California beauty who had married a British lord, Lee Radziwill, the sister of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, C.Z. Guest, the impossibly chic horsewoman and gardening columnist. But among these magnificent creatures, Babe Paley was his ultimate prize. She was, to him, the super swan, the living embodiment of everything he worshipped: beauty, grace, wealth, and effortless perfection. In return for the access she provided, Capote gave Babe something no one else could. He was not a rival like the other society women. He was not a demanding husband like Bill. He was a brilliant, endlessly amusing companion, a court jester for her private kingdom. With Truman, Babe could let the mask of perfection slip. He was her lunch partner, her travel companion on the Paley yacht, the Virago, and most importantly, her secret keeper. For hours on end, either over lunch at their favorite haunt, La Côte Basque, or in long confidential phone calls late at night, Babe would unburden herself to her new best friend. She told him everything, her profound loneliness, her frustration at being treated like a beautiful object, and most painfully, the deep and constant humiliation of Bill's endless philandering. Capote became the sole repository for her vulnerabilities. He listened with rapt attention, offered sympathy, made her laugh, and assured her of her own worth beyond her famous facade. He saw the cracks in the porcelain, and she loved him for it. She believed she had finally found a true platonic soulmate, someone who understood her as no one else did. She failed to understand that to a writer, a secret is not a sacred trust. It is raw material. For nearly a decade following In Cold Blood, the literary world held its breath, waiting for Capote's next masterpiece. He had been talking for years about his magnum opus, a novel to be titled Answered Prayers. He promised it would be a modern-day equivalent of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, a searing, epic takedown of the international jet set, a book that would expose the dark, decadent secrets of the super-rich. He boasted that it would be a work of art, but also a work of truth, built from the thousands of secrets he had collected over years of listening. His friends, his swans, heard these boasts. They were titillated, perhaps a little nervous, but ultimately they felt secure. They were his friends, his inner circle. They believed they were immune. Babe, most of all, trusted him implicitly. He was her Truman. He would never betray her. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The literary grenade landed in November of 1975. The fuse had been lit months earlier, when Capote, under pressure from his publisher and short on cash, sold a chapter from the unfinished novel to Esquire magazine. The title of the excerpt was La Côte Basque, 1965. The name itself was a shot across the bow, a direct reference to the chic French restaurant on East 55th Street that served as his private clubhouse with his swans. When the magazine hit the newsstands, a shockwave tore through the penthouses of Park Avenue. The story was not a generalized satire. It was a meticulously detailed, venomous, and instantly recognizable account of his closest friends, their darkest secrets laid bare for public consumption under the thinnest of fictional veils. The chapter unfolds as a long, boozy lunch between a writer-narrator, P.B. Jones, and a society figure named Lady Ina Coolberth, a character transparently based on Capote's friend, Slim Keith. As they dine, Lady Coolberth unleashes a torrent of vicious gossip about their mutual acquaintances, story after story of betrayal, depravity, and despair. He recounted the tragic story of Anne Woodward, a former showgirl who had shot and killed her banking heir husband years earlier, an event officially ruled an accident. In Capote's telling, the fictionalized character is a vulgar, scheming murderer, confirming the most vicious rumors that had circulated for years. Tragically, Anne Woodward, having been warned about the story's contents, committed suicide with science just days before the magazine was published. But this was only the overture. The true act of unforgivable violence was reserved for his dearest friend, Babe. In the story, Lady Coolberth recounts a tale about another of their friends, a couple named Cleo and Sidney Dillon. To anyone in their circle, it was screamingly obvious that Cleo was Babe Paley and Sidney was her husband, Bill. The anecdote that followed was an act of such calculated cruelty it remains breathtaking in its capacity to wound. The story tells of how Sidney Dillon, after a night with the governor's wife, returns home to his fastidiously clean wife, Cleo. His one-night stand, a woman he picked up afterwards, had been menstruating and had left a significant, telltale blood stain on the pristine sheets of their guest room bed. In the story, the boorish, disgusting Sidney tries to wash the stain out himself, only making it worse. He then confronts his wife, not to confess his infidelity with remorse, but to complain about the messy woman who has ruined his fine port-halt linens. He describes the encounter in graphic, contemptuous detail, and then demands Cleo handle the problem. This single passage was the unforgivable sin. It was a betrayal on multiple, devastating levels. First, it took the general, painful knowledge of Bill Paley's infidelity and rendered it specific, graphic, and grotesquely humiliating. It portrayed the powerful founder of CBS not as a charming rogue, but as a pathetic, squalid buffoon, concerned only with laundry. Second, and far more woundingly, it was almost certainly a story that Babe herself had told Capote in a moment of extreme, private pain. He had taken her deepest, most intimate hurt, a wound she had likely shared in tears in the supposed safety of their friendship, and had weaponized it, twisting it into a sordid public spectacle for the entertainment of strangers. He had taken her trauma and turned it into a punchline. Finally, the story was a vicious assault on Babe herself. The character of Cleo Dillon reacts to her husband's monstrous confession with an icy, detached calm, her only concern being the logistics of getting the sheets cleaned. Capote wrote, "She had a historical character, an instinct for the grand gesture, and what after all could be more life-sized, more co-equal to her own station than this opportunity to forgive, and not just forgive, but to ridiculously and magnificently forgive." He portrayed her not as a woman suffering in silence, but as a cold, unfeeling automaton, a creature of pure artifice. He used the secret pain she had shared with him to confirm the most damaging public caricature of her, that she was nothing more than a beautiful, frigid statue. It was a profound act of psychological violence, an assassination of her character executed with the intimacy of a lover and the coldness of an executioner. The fallout was immediate, absolute, and catastrophic. The moment Babe read the story, or more likely, had it read to her by a horrified friend, a curtain of iron descended. There were no public statements, no angry confrontations, no dramatic scenes. There was only silence. Babe Paley never spoke to Truman Capote again. From that day forward, his name was forbidden from being uttered in her presence. If it was mentioned by an unknowing guest, she would simply stare, impassive, until the subject was changed. He was, in an instant, erased from her life. Bill Paley, enraged by the public mockery and the pain inflicted on his wife, used the full weight of his CBS influence to ensure Capote became a pariah. Babe's reaction set the precedent. One by one, the other swans followed suit. Slim Keith, who had been fictionalized as the narrator of the venomous tales, cut him off completely. The social world that had once worshipped him now slammed its doors in his face. The invitations stopped coming. The phone calls went unreturned. He was banished, exiled from the gilded kingdom he had worked his entire life to penetrate. He had committed the cardinal sin of their universe. He had broken the code of omerta. In a world built on carefully maintained surfaces and discreetly hidden truths, he had told the truth, or a vicious version of it, out loud. Capote was genuinely shocked by the reaction. He seemed to believe that his genius gave him a kind of diplomatic immunity, that his friends would understand it was all in the service of art. He famously and plaintively asked, "What did they expect? I'm a writer. I use everything. Did they think I was just there to entertain them?" But he had fundamentally misunderstood his role. He wasn't their peer. He was their court favorite, their pet genius. He was allowed inside the palace walls precisely because they believed he was safe. By publishing La Côte Basque, he revealed himself not as a friend, but as a spy. The trust once shattered could never be repaired. For the rest of his life, Capote would be haunted by the loss of his swans, particularly Babe. He descended into a spiral of alcohol and drug abuse, his great novel, Answered Prayers, never to be finished. The man who had once been the toast of society died a lonely, broken figure in 1984. He had gained a legendary story, but he had lost his entire world. The silence of Babe Paley, the woman he once called his best friend, proved to be a far more powerful and enduring verdict than any literary review. The Great Betrayal by Truman Capote marked the beginning of the end. It was a social death for him, but for Babe Paley, it was the final cracking fissure in the perfect marble facade of her life. The shockwave of La Côte Basque had barely subsided when a far more inexorable and intimate enemy appeared on the horizon. The 1970s, a decade that began with the sisters at the apex of their power, would close with a final, tragic convergence, a shared fate that would strip away all artifice and reveal the unvarnished truths they had spent a lifetime concealing. The final act of the Cushing dynasty was not to be played out in the ballrooms or the gossip columns, but in the quiet, sterile rooms where life confronts its own mortality. In the years following the Capote scandal, a somber quiet fell over the lives of the sisters. For Babe, the social victory was a Pyrrhic one. She had banished her betrayer, but the episode had laid bare the painful realities of her marriage for all to see. The strain of her lifelong performance, compounded by the emotional violence of the betrayal, had taken its toll. A lifetime of chain smoking, the ubiquitous accessory of the glamorous and the anxious in her era, finally presented its bill. She was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. In a stroke of cruel cosmic irony, at almost the same time, her older sister, Minnie, received the exact same diagnosis. The two sisters who had chosen such radically different paths, Babe, who had sacrificed her inner self for a perfect public image, and Minnie, who had sacrificed public status for a private life of the mind, were now walking in lockstep toward the same final destination. The disease was a great, terrible equalizer, rendering their divergent choices moot as they faced a shared, inescapable end. For Babe, the diagnosis was not just a death sentence, it was a form of liberation. Staring at the definitive end of her life, the immense, lifelong burden of maintaining perfection simply fell away. The mask she had so meticulously crafted and worn for over 30 years finally dropped, and in her final months the world saw a Babe Paley it had never known. The serene, impossibly elegant hostess, who never showed a flicker of negative emotion, was replaced by a woman of raw, unfiltered honesty. The years of suppressed anger, resentment, and disappointment toward her husband, Bill, came pouring out. The silence she had maintained through decades of his infidelities was finally broken. Friends and family were stunned to witness her openly confronting him, cataloguing the pain his betrayals had caused her, and expressing the profound bitterness she felt for having been treated as his most prized yet most neglected possession. This transformation was not just about anger, it was about control. In a final, astonishing act of stage management, Babe began to meticulously plan her own funeral. She was directing her last and most important production. With the same precision she had once used to plan her legendary dinner parties, she chose the menu and wines for the luncheon that would follow the service. She compiled the guest list. She even began giving away pieces from her magnificent jewelry collection, personally selecting specific items for specific friends and wrapping them as gifts. It was a final assertion of her impeccable taste and her will. She was curating her own departure, ensuring that even in death the aesthetic would be flawless. But this time the performance was not for the world or for her husband. It was for herself, a final act of agency by a woman who had, for too long, allowed her life to be defined by others. While Babe was orchestrating her final exit, Minnie was facing her own battle with a quiet, stoic dignity that mirrored the way she had lived her life. Her final year, however, would be marked by a prelude of profound heartbreak. In April of 1978, her beloved husband, Jim Fosburgh, succumbed to his own battle with cancer. The man who had been her partner in her great escape, the source of her intellectual joy and companionship, was gone. Minnie, now frail and facing her own mortality, was left to navigate her final months utterly alone. The curtain began to fall with devastating speed. On July 6, 1978, less than 3 months after Jim's death, Barbara "Babe" Cushing Paley died in her New York apartment. She was 63 years old. The high priestess of perfection was gone, and with her an entire era of American style seemed to vanish. Her funeral was, by all accounts, exactly as she had planned it. A somber, elegant affair, her final, flawless production. Bill Paley, the man who had been the source of both her greatest glory and her deepest pain, was reportedly consumed by a grief deeply complicated by the guilt of her final, candid months. The drumbeat of tragedy continued. Just 4 months later, on November 4, 1978, Mary Minnie Cushing Fosburgh followed her younger sister. Her death was a quieter affair, attracting less public fanfare, a fitting coda to a life that had purposefully turned away from the spotlight. In the space of 7 short months, the Cushing family had lost Jim, Babe, and Minnie. 2 of the 3 magnificent ships that Gogi Cushing had launched with such ambition had completed their voyages and disappeared over the horizon. And then there was one. Betsey Cushing Whitney, the last sister standing. She who had been groomed as the diplomat, the steady hand, had outlived them all. She had watched her sister's turbulent ascensions, their painful compromises, and their tragic, premature ends. Her own life, grounded in a genuine partnership with Jock Whitney, had been the one true success story by any measure of personal happiness. Now, her final role was that of caretaker. As Jock's own health began to fail, she devoted herself to him with the same quiet, steadfast dedication that had defined her entire life. She nursed him through his final years until his death in 1982. Left a widow of immense wealth and stature, Betsey fully ascended to the role of matriarch of the Whitney dynasty. She did not seek the limelight like Babe or host intellectual salons like Minnie. She retreated into a life of immense but quiet power. From her sprawling estate in Manhasset, she presided over the Green Tree Foundation, the vast Whitney philanthropic enterprise, directing hundreds of millions of dollars toward medicine, education, and the arts with a sharp, discerning eye. She was a formidable figure, respected and admired, the final embodiment of the Cushing name, now inextricably woven into the fabric of one of America's greatest families. She lived her final years with a quiet, powerful dignity, a long and peaceful twilight after the dazzling, often stormy days of her sister's reigns. On March 25, 1998, Betsey Cushing Whitney died at the age of 89, the last of Gogi's glorious daughters to leave the stage. What, then, is the enduring legacy of the Cushing sisters? Theirs is a story of breathtaking ambition, a saga of how 3 women, operating within the rigid constraints of a patriarchal world, built a female dynasty of unparalleled influence. Their mother, Gogi, a master strategist, saw marriage not as a sacrament of love, but as a career path, and she groomed her daughters to be its most brilliant executives. They succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, conquering the worlds of politics, finance, and media. They became synonymous with elegance, taste, and a certain kind of distinctly American aristocracy. Yet their story is also a profound and cautionary tale. It is a testament to the immense personal cost of a life lived in the public eye, a life dedicated to the relentless pursuit of perfection. The magnificent existences they built were like exquisitely designed houses, admired by all who passed. But were they truly homes? For Babe, The answer was a heartbreaking no. Her palace was a gilded prison of loneliness and betrayal. For Minnie, the Astor fortune was a cage from which she had to engineer a daring escape to find true happiness. Only Betsey, the quiet diplomat, seemed to find a sustainable peace, a genuine partnership that anchored her against the turbulent tides of society. The lives of Minnie, Betsey, and Babe Paley shimmer in the rearview mirror of history, an image of impossible glamour and grace. But their story resonates not just as a chronicle of a bygone era of society swans and media moguls. It is a timeless human drama about the eternal conflict between our public facades and our private selves, about the choices we make, the prices we pay, and the beautiful, fragile, and often heartbreaking art of creating a life. Their collective legacy is not just one of style, but of substance, a powerful and poignant reminder of the crushing weight of perfection. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know what stories we should cover next.